What we're going to talk about tonight is two films, Mushroom Club and White Light, Black Rain. And our very special guest is Steven Okazaki. So I'll just give a very, very brief bio. Most of you should be familiar with him, but Steven is a Southern California native, grew up in Venice, California, got his film degree at SF State. And I don't want to spend the whole time talking about all his accolades, but for our purposes tonight, we should know that he won an Academy Award for a documentary called Days of Waiting. And Steven appeared at J-Sei a few years ago to show that documentary and to talk about it. And that was the first time that I got to meet him and talk to him. And then Steven came back last year to talk about his documentary called Mifune, The Last Samurai. And that was really a lot of fun too. But we're gonna talk about the films that he's done that's about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because most of you know that 75 years ago, last week, was the atomic bombings. And as I mentioned, I think I just mentioned, Mushroom Club was nominated for an Academy Award. White Light, Black Rain received a Primetime Emmy for nonfiction filmmaking. And so it was well received, but you know, this was back in 2005, 2007. And so one of the things that we're gonna try to talk to Steven about is to plumb his memory for how this project came about. And the background to these projects also goes far back. So we're really going to go back in time with Steven and sort of relive how these documentaries came into being. One of the things that struck me today is it's so dang hot that I don't perform all that well in the heat. I kind of wilt, but it made me think 75 years ago in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was it this hot? You know, Japan tends to get very hot in the summer. It's kind of a humid, muggy kind of hot. And even though the bombings occurred in the morning, I was just thinking, what was it like? Was it already starting to get warm that day? So anyway, that's one of the things I was thinking. So all right, enough about me. Steven, welcome.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Good to be there.
Yeah, not too hot?
I'm okay. I've got a fan above me, so.
You're lucky. I don't. I have an open window, so if people hear things, it's because my window's open. So I should start off by saying, how are you? How is everyone in your circle? Are you doing okay?
I'm doing fine. We're doing fine. We've all adjusted and, you know, like everyone else, doing okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a weird time. You know, nobody feels normal, but what have you been, what do you do to sort of get through your workday? Are you trying to work as normal?
Well, I have an office in Berkeley and it's pretty deserted. So actually, I've been going to my office and doing some work. And initially I was mostly at home and I weeded for a couple weeks. I got the yard in really good shape. And then I don't know, and I did some house repairs, patched a bunch of poles. I had a whole list. I went through the whole list, and then at some point, well, actually, the weeds start coming back really quickly. So then you go back to those. But I've been sort of going back to work, doing just a bit of fundraising for other projects with other people, and some of them are going well, some of them are not, and but you know, I'm old now, so you know, I don't really want to work too much.
You are not old. All right, well, we're all old then, all of us are, but I mean, I think just these conditions are challenging all of us. I know, I think I said to you the other day, I'm so sick of my own cooking. I dream about eating somebody else's food.
Yeah, I do most of the cooking in our house, and I'm really sick of it. I realize that no matter what I make, if it's Japanese or Mexican or Italian, it kind of tastes the same to me. Because you approach your dishes sort of the same way. So I've been trying to shake it up and throw chilies and things into the meals, and but it's yeah, that's an issue. Yeah, it's getting kind of radical. Sometimes I've just taken one dish that's fine and just thrown in a bunch of Korean hot spices in just to make it more interesting. Yeah.
Well, that sounds good. I mean, uh, better than I thought you were going to say you just threw it out because you were sick of it, but that's good. And then I know that, what's funny is we were supposed to get together in March. You were going to be our first guest curator. I'm hearing feedback, sorry. So anyway, you were supposed to be our first guest, our guest curator back in March because you had chosen a film that you wanted all of us to watch. Do you remember what film you picked?
Yeah, it was. I picked Tampopo because it's basically pretty much out of circulation. I mean, you cannot get a DVD of it, and it's only on one streaming service. Well, I don't even know if you can stream it, but it's with the Criterion collection. But that film has pretty much disappeared, as a lot of the Itami films or Japanese films of that period of the 70s, 80s, 90s are really hard to see now. So anyway, I hadn't seen Tampopo in a long time, and when I was working on Mifune, The Last Samurai, I was talking to Kurosawa's longtime scriptwriter, Teruya Nogami, and I asked her how she got started, and she said she wrote a kind of fan letter to the Japanese director, and this would be the silent era, the late 30s, named Mansaku Itami, and and he, I don't know that she actually met him, but he helped her in her career and got her started in movies. And then later, she became like the babysitter for his family, and she was basically the babysitter for Itami Yuzo, and so she knew him all his life, and so that drew me back. And the other thing is, I got to, when I was doing research for Mifune, I tried to see as many old silent films as I could with a samurai theme. And there were a couple, not complete films, but a couple reels of, the reels were about 20 minutes from a couple of Itami films, and Itami Yuzo's father's films. And I found them they were really interesting. They were kind of more European, more sophisticated for a samurai film, and they were a lot, they had a lighter tone, a really kind of sophisticated sense of humor that you don't see in those early silent samurai films, and it reminded me a lot of Itami's films. So I was kind of anxious to see Tampopo, and then when you brought it up, I thought, oh, I hadn't seen that in ages, and so I got a Blu-ray copy and was waiting to show it, and then this happened. So.
Oh. Yeah, I could kick myself because I remember talking to you about possible dates, and I think I was the one who said, well, let's do it in March because our previous time with you when we showed the Mifune film was in March. And so I said, well, let's do it again in March, that there's a nice symmetry to it. And and then this happens, and I thought, oh, dang it, I should have scheduled you for earlier. So that was my fault, everybody, sorry. And hopefully once this is all over, we can get back to that and keep it on our schedule. So hang on to that Blu-ray. But also, as long as I've got you and we're talking about Japanese films, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you if you are watching any Japanese films during shelter in place and what that means to you.
Uh, well, yeah, I mean, I think like everyone else, I was watching a lot of, Netflix and Amazon Prime when this started, and I got really, I don't know, I got really sick of them and of most of what I was watching. And even if it was sort of interesting, I realized, really, I don't want to watch like 8 or 12 episodes of this show. And so I just thought the commitment and the payoff was getting sort of less and less rewarding. And so I started trying to watch more movies. And in the beginning, I was kind of, kind of cheap. I was very wary signing up for another streaming service. And so I was trying to watch, I had this challenge of how many Ozu films I could watch for free. And so I, I was going through I went through YouTube and found, various versions of Ozu films. And I watched of all his sound films. I think I saw almost all of them except for about 4 or 5 that were available on YouTube, and I sort of got obsessed with seeing them. And I realized the final couple I could not find, and I would have to watch. I would have to subscribe to the Criterion channel, and so I started. Also while I was also on YouTube, I was watching a lot of Mizoguchi films, and that was exciting. I hadn't. I don't know. I lots of the films I hadn't seen in a long time, and I think with both Ozu and Mizoguchi, I mean, watching them as a 20-year-old, as a 30-year-old, and then as a 40, 50, 60-year-old, it's really your take on the film is so different, and especially with Ozu, you connect with the now I connect with the old characters, and before when I first saw them, I connected with the younger characters, and but I don't know if found them so rewarding to see, and so I don't know, even the ones I've seen many times, just fascinating. And then when you watch a lot of them at the same time, you have a sense of that acting group of the pool of actors, and watching the various actors play different ages, and play young men in one, and especially Chisu Ryu, who plays young man in one, and then just grays his hair, and is completely um, believable as as a 60-year-old man. But anyway, I was going to just get the Criterion trial 14 days for free, and then I just got hooked, and now I've been watching it for 2 months, and I'm trying to watch. I don't know. I've been watching almost exclusively Japanese films. The Ozus, the Mizoguchis, the Naruse. Lately, I've been watching a bunch of the Masaki Kobayashi films. He's most famous for the Human Condition series, which I liked a lot when I was young, and was kind of annoyed by it this time around. But his other films, I don't know, hold up really well. And right now I'm watching Harakiri, and comparing it to the new version. And I don't know, it's both are really strong films. So yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Wow. I mean, so uh, these movies feel different to you because you're older now watching them. But is there also something about being in this lockdown that has affected you in the way you appreciate these films?
Ah, I hadn't really thought about that. I suppose I don't know. You have your well, I suppose they mean a lot more because you're a lot less. I think most of us are a lot less distracted. You realize how much multitasking you do, and even when you're if you're watching television, people are doing things. I don't know, knitting or whatever, and lifting weights or something. And it's I feel like, I don't know, I guess, I mean, my desire is for this period, like I can at least look back and say, ah, I saw 100 Japanese films. The other thing that's been really interesting is I've been, is looking at pre-war Japan. Um, the films made during the war are completely negligible, and I think many were, embarrassing and then were burned and purposely lost. But watching the films, in the 30s, watching that transition of Japan, it's almost like, in some ways, we're watching a documentary, because and many times it is a documentary because they're walking on the Ginza, in 1950, and that's what it looks like. And you look and they're showing in some of the old Kurosawa films, they show real neighborhoods, and so they're not sets. And the films that were made right after the war, they could barely afford sets. And but it's fascinating to see, I don't know, just that mindset. And you forget, we're so used to the prosperous, everything neat and perfect Japan. You just forget how devastated the whole country was after the war, and how long it took, for it to get back on its feet. And watching those Mizoguchi films, and where, average people, women, housewives have to become prostitutes, and that was a real thing. I've met people in Hiroshima whose mothers became prostitutes, and even now, they're people look askance at them for, even though, it's obvious people made tremendous sacrifices and experience, just the, worst kind of hunger and worst kind of poverty. Those themes of, most people sold their clothes, their kimonos, and but I don't know, it's just really, it's not just, those realities, but watching, I don't know, the values, watching the films in the 30s where things are getting a little decadent, and there's a push and pull between the old ways and the new ways. I don't know, that's been, I think, the most fascinating thing for me. And along with that, I don't know, I've been doing reading, and so I've been particularly, while I've been watching them, I've been reading a book called Japan at War. It's an oral history, and really one of the best books I've read about Japan. And it's all oral histories, and it's really an amazing book. Just really moving stories, and it's sort of, I don't know, you get a feeling of all the things that are leading up to Hiroshima, just the madness and the emperor worship and the blind obedience, and just the corruption of the military and the government, and then Hiroshima, and then this, and then the rebuilding, and all these stories are in there, and it's really extraordinary.
Yeah, thanks. That's a nice segue to what we're about to get into. But first, I want to read a comment from Yuriko, who says, cinema was one of the methods of democratization during the occupation post-war. There should be a rather dramatic transition after the war. Apparently, sex and sports were the other two big themes during the Allied occupation. So, yeah, I love the movies from that period because they teach us so much, especially the post-war ones. But you're right, the pre-war ones also are super interesting. I wish more of those films had survived, but I don't think they did. But I think we're going to talk a little bit about Japanese values in the context of Hiroshima and the aftermath of the bombings. So why don't we get into it? First of all, I will say that this is not a specialization of mine. So I'm going to tread on this subject matter carefully because I don't want to say anything wrong. I know that there are some people in the audience who know a whole lot more about this than I do. So please feel free to comment in the chats. And if it works, I'd be happy to bring you into the conversation too, to talk about, say, hibakusha or interviewing survivors. I would be really interested to hear other people's perspectives as well. But Steven, let's let's talk about your involvement in the hibakusha story. I think I'd rather think about your films as telling the story of hibakusha, not telling the story about the bombs so much, right? Like what I love about your films is that you focus on the people who were affected. And I've read some interviews that you gave around 2007 where people kept trying to ask you, what was your political stance? What was the message of these documentaries? Where were you coming from? And I think the fact that the documentaries keep focusing on the people is what gives it a particular strength. So can you sort of reach back in your memory and tell us even how your interest in this started?
Sure. Well, I first got interested in the hibakusha in 1980, and I was at that point I had made some children's films and was just doing freelance film work and not particularly focused on doing documentaries. I was just wanted to do film work and have more experience. And at that time, my youngest sister, Hannah, was at San Francisco State, and um, I called her up one day, and well, this was at the urging of my mom. Said, are you looking after your younger sister? And I said, oh, yeah, sure. And so I called her up and said, asked her when we were talking about what she was doing, and she was excited. She had a class, and I can't remember what the class was. I think it was in ethnic studies, and she was doing an interview with a hibakusha that lived near San Francisco State, and the woman's name was Kuniko Jenkins, and she had married an American serviceman. And come and moved to San Francisco, and anyway, and I said, "Wow, that sounds really interesting." And I don't. Oh, and then at the time, there was a film festival at. Well, I don't know if it was a film festival. They were running a series of films at the Pacific Film Archive about the bomb, and
Oh, can I interrupt? What year are we talking?
I, I'm thinking it's 1980. I'm not absolutely sure. It might be 79.
Okay.
But they showed, I would say, 7, 8, 9 films, short and long, about the building of the bomb, about the dropping of the bomb, about the why of the bomb, and the science and the history. And there were of the 9 or so films, only one of them had one of the people who experienced the bomb in it. And even that film, they had 2 survivors on, and they were only on for, I would say, less than a minute. And there were 1 or 2 women and that were blinded by the flash, and so that's why they were in the film, to sort of show them. But they barely said it. I don't know if they said anything in the film, but it was sort of a shock to me. Like, how could you make a film about the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and have no survivors? I mean, how can you have something where the people that survived it, that saw it, that experienced it, aren't in any of these films? And so I was just kind of appalled and offended. And so I called my sister up and said, maybe, I could, help her. Well, this was my mom's priming again. My mom, but I called my sister up and I said, maybe we could. I'd like to meet one of the survivors, and maybe it's a good film idea. And she said, "Oh, I dropped that class," and and I said, "Oh, well, give me the information." And so I followed up, and I talked to the woman, Kuniko Jenkins, and I visited her, and she said, "Well, if you're interested, you should come to a meeting. We have a meeting once a month at the Sumitomo Bank community room in Japantown, and you should come to the meeting, but you'll have to ask the president of the survivors group, which was called the Committee of Atomic Bomb Survivors, CABS, and I called him. His name's Kanji Kuramoto. He's a really anxious, nervous guy, really kind of driving force behind the group. Anyway, he just said, okay, you want to come to the meeting? You want to, if you make movies, why don't you bring a movie? And I said, well, I just make children's films. He said, bring one of the children's films. And I said, okay. And I went to the meeting and I brought a children's film. One of the children's films I've made was about 10 minutes long. And I lugged the projector and the screen across, for about 2 blocks. I showed my 10-minute film, and when it was over, they clapped politely, and one of the hibakusha women stood up, and she said, I think Mr. Okazaki should make a film about the hibakusha. Everyone who agrees, raise your hand. And everyone in the room raised their hand, and I just, I had not taken it seriously until that moment. I just thought, well, it might be a good idea or not, And at that moment, I realized I had committed myself to making a film. And because these women, and mostly women, they were, I would say there are about 20 women and about 2 or 3 men. And they looked like my mom and my aunt. And I just thought, there's no way I can, just have used up their wasted their time, shown up, and then disappeared. And so at that moment, I committed myself to doing it. And so I made a film called Survivors, and I really felt when I was doing it, I realized I was kind of over my head, but I was kind of arrogant. I thought, I know what I'm doing. And I really was kind of intimidated by the subject, and I didn't ask hard questions when they were already kind of reticent, and most of I didn't know this at the time, but Hiroshima survivors are a lot more are really stoic people, and they, as opposed to Nagasaki people, they're from Kyushu, more like Southerners versus Northerners, and the Hiroshima people were really difficult to talk to. And so anyway, the film went okay, and because there was nothing like that, there was no films with survivors. The film got picked up by WGBH, which had had a regular slot. It's now called Frontline, but it was then called World, and so it went up nationally on PBS, and it was my first documentary. And from doing that film, none of the film was shot in Japan, but a group in Hiroshima who knew me, connected with me through a friend of mine named Dorothy Stroop, who had spent time in Hiroshima. She was kind of a journalist. She taught at UC Berkeley's ESL program. And anyway, a group in Hiroshima raised money for the film. And I think it was like $15,000 or something. And they contacted me and said, we've raised this money. And I said, great, and thank you. And they said, but you'll have to come to Hiroshima to get it. And I said, like, when? And I was really dreading, because I had not been to Japan, and also I hate hot weather. And they said, you have to come to Japan in August on August 6th. And so that would be, I guess, 81. So that would be, yeah. So it was the 1981. And they said, you'll have to come to receive the check. You'll have to come all the way to Hiroshima. And so I said, okay. And so that was my first time in Hiroshima. And from that, I, connected to the hibakusha community there. And I thought to myself, well, I just, I was really unhappy with the survivors film, the Japanese American survivors film. And I thought, well, maybe one day I can do it when I'm, more capable. This is a really long story. And so anyway, I set my sights on making a film for the 50th anniversary of the bombing, which would be 1995. And is it right? Which would be 1995. And at that time, so I had won the Oscar in 1991. And so Japanese TV was very interested in me, and my film Days of Waiting had played on NHK and had a great response. And so there was an opportunity so NHK approached me and asked me if I'd like to do a documentary for them. And I said, yeah, I'd like to do a film for the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima. And they said, great. And I did research there. I lived there for a couple months, and then I gave them a proposal, and then they said, this is too critical of Japan, particularly the way the Japanese government had treated the hibakusha, and so they canceled the project. And I had salvaged the project a little bit with the Smithsonian at a much smaller budget. I was going to do a film for the Smithsonian, which would be in connection with their showing, having a big exhibit around the Enola Gay, the airplane that dropped the bomb. And they were planning a pretty ambitious exhibit around the Enola Gay. And so I was going to do a small documentary for them for the 50th. And then the veterans group started protesting against any too sympathetic depiction of what happened to the hibakusha. And there was a lot of heat, and the executive director of the Smithsonian lost his job. He buckled from the pressure, but then also somehow lost his job. And so the same thing happened. So the American side of the project canceled the project for me again and said it was too sympathetic to the Japanese. And so I was forlorn and angry, and couldn't do the film, which I had been planning to do for almost for 10 years. And then so I knew the next anniversary was coming up, so that would be 2005. And I thought and I had other issues with PBS and funding and their concerns about getting anyone upset, the right or the left. And so I decided to make a really small film with these new digital cameras that I really liked working with, and so I decided to make a film for the 60th anniversary in 2005. And I was just going to make my own film, and I got some small grants. And I made, based on all the visits I had made to Hiroshima, the interesting stories I had connected with, people that I had a sort of collection of stories that I wanted to tell. And my wife and I just went, and she helped me do the interviews and held the microphone and stuff. And so I just shot this really inexpensive film. And I just thought, well, I'll find a way. Someone will pick it up, hopefully. And so I was working on finishing the film. I didn't have a broadcaster or anything for the film. I forget what I was thinking. I just felt I had to make the film, and I had to do something. After failing on the first film, and then having and then having the project fall apart. So I decided to make the Mushroom Club. So I shot the Mushroom Club, and I was just editing it and finishing it, and I got a call from HBO, and they said, you want to come to New York and talk about making a film about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And because they had just realized the 60th anniversary was coming up, and it was getting, a little bit of it. Someone had come and talked to them about it, and they went, "Oh, that's a good idea." So HBO asked me if I would be interested in doing a film for this 60th, and I said, "Well, the 60th is a couple months away, and so that's not enough time." And they said, "That's okay. Let's just make it for whenever." And so HBO said, whatever you need, and whatever time and whatever budget you need. And so suddenly, I had completely given up on the notion of making the film, but suddenly it just really just fell into my lap. And the opportunity to make White Light, Black Rain. And I don't know, there was such momentum on having wanted to do the film for so long that as soon as they said go, the film, I think the whole production was done in 9 months. And I don't even, when I look back at my calendar, I can't even figure out how we did it, because we did a lot of shooting, plus we had to track down four the guys who had dropped the bomb, and the four Americans, the surviving Americans who had dropped the bomb, and somehow the whole film came together, and it really on this incredible momentum, and then it got made, and it was up on HBO for August 2007. So sorry, a very long answer, but it really was a long process to get there.
Yeah, that's great that you were so patient. I think let's separate the two projects because they feel very different to me. So Mushroom Club just feels so personal that the first time I saw it, I thought you had family in Hiroshima, because there was just something so personal in it for you. That's the sense that I got. Do you have any family from that part of Japan?
No, I have no family. My mother's side of the family is kind of close to Hiroshima. They're on Shikoku, the island across from Hiroshima. They're in Ehime-ken, and then my father's family is north of Tokyo in Ibaraki, and so both are not typical places for Japanese to immigrate from. But no, we haven't. So yeah, I know lots of Japanese Americans come from Hiroshima and the areas around it, but I have no family connection at all to it. But just being there, and anyone who's interested in the Hiroshima story, people just they just embrace you and pull you in, and then it's you feel like family, and people go out of their way to help you. And so I connected with the family there, and a woman named Tomoko Watanabe has been helping me for the last 20 years in Hiroshima. And they're at the time, during the bubble, the Japanese bubble, there were newspapermen, all over. I'm sure people ran into them in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and they were, there were correspondents from Hiroshima, and they were a tremendous amount of help back then, connecting you to good stories. And sometimes you just find, when you find them there, you just ask a question, and of the taxi driver, and he turns out to be a hibakusha with a fascinating story. But when I did the Mushroom Club, I just thought, especially there's, the one woman in the film who collects the buttons on the riverside. I just thought, we have to make the film because she won't be around. And she was just kind of amazing. And one of the other stories in the film was this Hatanaka family of who had a daughter who was in her utero at the time, and she was very physically, she was very mentally disabled, really about a 2-year, had the mental capacity of a 2-year-old. And I thought, neither the father or the daughter would be around much longer. And but the father started a group with the journalists, started a group called the Kinoko Kai. Kinoko, is that the word for mushroom? Kinoko?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. They started a group called the Kinoko Kai. So the title of the film comes from them, the Mushroom Club. So it was, I don't know, yeah, it was just something. I just felt, these people had been talking to me, there's so many people that were excited about doing the film for the 50th and really reached out to me and introduced me to people. And then for it to fall apart, I felt like I had to do something. And it's interesting. I mean, Hiroshima's, well, it's kind of physically kind of interesting because you have these rivers that that sort of go out to the sea, that cut through the city. That sort of makes it interesting. And you have mountain ranges around it that are accessible, but it's not that interesting a city except for the story, the bomb story. And so I mean, it's not my favorite place to hang out with if I'm in Japan, but I spent just an enormous amount of time just sitting in the Peace Park and thinking about a film and trying to sort of sift through. And I don't know. And I guess the other thing is the stories are really hard to get because you have to go through so much. You have to meet so many people and sit there, and sometimes it's not a good story, but you have to spend 3 hours politely drinking tea with the journalists or a subject or someone who says they can help you. And I don't know, I invested myself in it. And so I still feel, I don't know, I still feel attached to Hiroshima in a way. And I always say, why, it's hot down there, and it's not the most fun place to be. But I feel when I haven't been there in a long time, I feel really drawn to it, and really drawn to the stories there.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to mention that you narrate the Mushroom Club, so that adds that sort of dimension of sort of personal connection as well. Did you always know you were going to be the narrator?
It just seemed like the only way to do it, and to simply to make sort of, to connect stories and to get the background in, and maybe probably if I had filmed things better, maybe I wouldn't have needed to. But it did sort of inform, it did sort of inform White Light, Black Rain, and that I decided I didn't want any narration. I don't want, and I didn't want any voices in it. I felt like the story is so strong, it just tells itself. And so, but I don't know, I had done a short documentary called Hunting Tigers, which was about in Tokyo. And and I had narrated that because the stories were, the film was from my point of view. And I guess I thought the story would be easiest told just, and I guess I'm always worried with the film about Hiroshima that the audience is going to be very wary about what they're going to see and hear. And so I thought, sort of using my taking a trip there as a sort of vehicle to tell the story might, just make it a little bit less threatening.
Yeah. I do want to talk to you about all the interviews that you did for this movie. I do also want to point out that in the chat, it's been brought to my attention that we have a survivor of Hiroshima in our Zoom audience tonight by the name of Tanemori Takashi-san. So I hope he tells a really interesting anecdote about meeting Paul Tibbets. Maybe we can draw him into the conversation. I won't insist on it, but I'll just put out that invitation that Tanemori-san is welcome to join in the conversation if he would like to. I can't imagine interviewing that many people. I heard that in all, you met over 500 people over the course of making both documentaries, and you interviewed over 100, and then you had to kind of decide which ones you could use for the film. So, I mean, that is quite, and then to find out that you actually made White Light, Black Rain in 9 months, that's kind of incredible. So, what kind of a toll did this take on you? How did you do it?
Well, I had a lot of time. When I was making the first film with the Japanese American survivors, I did it. I built the film around the medical visits that every 2 years doctors from Hiroshima come and test, do various tests on the hibakusha in the United States. I don't know if they still do it. I assume they do. And I was just there all the time, and people were waiting, to be examined, get their examination and such. And so I just went around and met as many people as I could, and then I was quite often in this in a situation where I would say to the people helping me in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, "Oh, I'd like to meet some hibakusha," and they said, "Well, maybe that will be difficult." I said, "Well, whatever you can do," and I would, and they said, "Well, we'll try." And I would, say, "Well, we could just do it at this coffee shop or something like that." I mean, that would be like 1 or 2 people. And then, I don't know, every time they would say, "It's very hard to get hibakusha," they would put the word out, and 10, 12 hibakusha would show up instead of 2. And so, I would have to, so I, would go around the room and have everyone tell a bit of their story, and then go around some more and talk about various things. And so, so it wasn't, I did a lot of pre-interviewing a lot of people in that situation. And so, a lot of it wasn't in depth, it was just trying to get an idea of if they would be good in the film. And often, as soon as I sensed that they had a story, even if they barely said anything, you could just feel it. You could just feel that they had something that was there. And often I would just not follow it up at all. I would just say, "Please be in the film." And usually those people would be very reticent, but I don't know, whenever I felt that, it would, those would be the most extraordinary stories. And so I would never, none of my pre-interviews were in depth before I chose them. It was just a sense, I mean, a lot of times people say this person has an amazing story, and, so many of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki stories are, just extraordinary stories of survival in, just unimaginable situations. But the ability to tell that story, whether it's in English or Japanese, and tell it well is a sort of different thing. And so you would also, look for a certain amount of poise. the one thing I, was a real learning experience for me was meeting Nagasaki survivors, who are really different than Hiroshima survivors. As I said, they're much more talky. Hiroshima is kind of, is politically and, very liberal, and but socially really conservative. I remember once I was there, and the city had introduced new trash bags for trash collection, and they were clear bags. And everyone was really upset because they were clear bags. That meant your neighbor would see what you eat and throw out. And throughout Hiroshima, people would be arranging their trash, so that it would just like the good things, admirable trash. And it was a subject that came up constantly. Or you'd be walking by and people go, look at that, look at that person's trash. And that was like, sort of symbolic of life in Hiroshima, that people really are very conscious of what other people think and say and feel about them. And that's a lot of pressure. And, in Japanese culture, really, you're not supposed to elicit pity from people by telling your stories. And so there's a lot of shame put on people who have these stories, like, why are you talking about that? Not just because, why are you talking about the bomb? Let's forget it. It's more like, why are you talking about that to make people feel sorry for you? I mean, it's like, you're supposed to be strong, I mean, Japanese hold it in. And and you really feel that in Hiroshima, that people really are holding in, and that affects the interviews. The other thing is, like, when there are a lot of hibakusha that people want you to interview that talk all the time. And I found that they were not great interviews, that they had told their story in such a canned way. And they had told their story to people in a way not to upset people in certain ways and to make certain points about, about nuclear weapons. And they were just not really, just themselves. They were, felt like they were giving speeches. And the other thing is, people that tell their stories a lot, as time goes by, the stories start changing, and you kind of, and I found that some people, like, would, not on purpose, adopt other people's stories as part of their own, and in the retelling. If they were telling their story every week, at the Peace Park to groups of students and stuff, their stories started to get really stilted and sort of dramatized and sort of, and so you're looking for people who haven't, told their story a lot. And so when I went to Nagasaki, I was really taken aback how Nagasaki survivors hardly ever talk. They're hardly ever in the press, in Japan or here. And so nearly everyone except one famous woman that's in the film, none of the people had given an interview before. And as I, again, Kyushu people are, much more open, sort of socially. They're much, I think people in other parts of Japan might say they're rougher and more crass, but they're much, they're much less socially uptight. And so I think that, and they responded to questions that I've asked other people, and just really openly. And I was taken aback how descriptive, their stories were. And so in White Light, Black Rain, it's heavy on Nagasaki stories. There's 8 interviewees from Nagasaki, and there's 6 from Hiroshima. And the 6 people that that I interviewed in Hiroshima, only one of them actually lived in Hiroshima when we did the interview. So the others were in ways just more liberated. They lived in Tokyo, outside of Japan. There was a Korean hibakusha, so she lived in North Korea. and and one of the hibakusha, Shigeko Sasumori, lives in Los Angeles, and so the Hiroshima people, we only interviewed one person. Well, we interviewed several, but at the end result is only one person that actually lives in Hiroshima is in the film.
Hmm. That's fascinating. Didn't know that. I did want to I want to mention a couple of chat comments that we're getting. I did want to mention that both Jerry Honda and Kei Atabe are in the audience tonight. So I hope at some point, maybe after we talk about the films, and maybe we can devote a segment to talking about activism or groups that are active now about hibakusha rights and care, and maybe any anti-nuclear activism that's going on. And so I hope maybe Jerry and Kay and Kanamori-san maybe can join us at that point. But Jerry writes, Steven, so appreciate your presence and inspired by your, what happened? Lost it. By your heartfelt support of atomic bomb survivors, especially those residing in the United States, and as one of the founding members of the Friends of Hibakusha. The biennial medical visits, which began in 1977, still continue in San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles, and Honolulu. So maybe we can talk at some point about Friends of Hibakusha and how that got started. I hope we can talk about that. I'd like to go back to the movie just for a little bit, because I was struck by the openness of the interviewees with you. I assume you were there for the filming of all of these segments, and a couple things struck me. One is it's this wonderful combination that I see in Japanese people. It's a combination of pragmatism and stoicism, but mixed with heartfelt emotion. Like, not afraid to cry in front of a camera, not afraid to tell the truth, but also with sort of this very almost, it's this wonderful combination of objective subjective that I love about the Japanese personality. And I know that one of the things that the Japanese culture kind of has is a real relationship with the dead. And so there's always sort of an ongoing conversation with people who have passed. And I think people who aren't familiar with the Japanese culture would not realize that, and that it comes so naturally to just keep this open, continuous conversation with family members who have passed or loved ones who've passed. So that sort of made me think, you as a Japanese American, and I know one of your translators was Taro Goto, who was our guest last month for movie night. He talked a little bit about the translation work he did for White Light, Black Rain, and how it affected him. Like it drained him to have to hear the words and then to translate the words as though he was, he felt like he was actually living it, by saying the words of these people. And I was wondering, to what extent do you think people might have opened up to say you or Taro, knowing that you were Japanese American and that maybe you would sort of, you could relate to how they were feeling or how they deal with adversity or trauma?
Well, yeah, I think that, I think that a responsive, non-threatening Japanese person could, just as well gotten, the same or better interviews than we did. But just, but I do think us being Japanese American, on one hand, made them comfortable, and a little more comfortable, but also gave them the feeling that, well, these people are not going to judge me, and they're not from my community, and um, so I think they were more open in the interviews. I mean, but I'd say my general feeling though was that people really, no one asks them about what happened. It's just, and you know, you go your whole life, and your husband says, please don't talk about this. You the neighbors, I mean, people don't. There is real prejudice towards hibakusha in Japan, and even among hibakusha community, there's prejudice for the way for people, whatever happened to people, for whatever they had to do to survive. And so that to have someone in there who not gonna, they feel well, these not so smart Japanese American film crew, maybe I'll just tell my story, and so I think, but at the same time, I think having a Japanese face to talk to, made them, not feel like, oh, I have to perform, I think they would stand up straighter maybe if we were not Japanese American, if they felt like they had to represent, their whole culture. But I don't know, it was the great thing is when when we screened the film, and the person initially, their families had no knowledge of their background and what happened, and this was several people, but not the majority of them, but where their families were now really, really accepting of having them talk in public, and proud of them, for doing so. And that was really moving to see. Some people were reticent. There's a man in the film, Fukuhori, who has perfectly groomed white hair, and he had a really rough time at the war, and he alluded to joining the Yakuza to survive, and he had a wife and family, but he was always kind of alone, and it took a lot to get him to say yes to be in the film. But he was completely open during the interview, but as soon as it was over, he just he just clammed up again and said, fine, you're welcome. And even at the screening, he just kind of nodded to us, and kind of sort of walked away from everybody else, and was by himself, and clearly gave off this feeling of don't talk to me. And so it's, the scars are still really real for people, and you feel that, and there's one woman in the film, her name is Shimohira, and she, from the moment she lost her sister killed herself after the bombing, she's never ever said her sister's name since then. So for 75 years, she still hasn't said her sister's name. It's so painful. So
yeah, that was one of the stories that really got me. So I'd like to. We're getting some good comments, so I want to try to incorporate those comments as well. But one thing I wanted to talk about with White Light, Black Rain in particular was your decision to sort of tell the story in almost like a chronological order. That you, by focusing on the hibakusha and their experience, you wanted to be sort of true to this to what they experienced. So whereas maybe other documentaries might have shown some of that archival footage. I think you said this archival footage that took place weeks or days or weeks after the blast, you wanted to show what was actually happening closer to real time. And so you chose to use other means, other visual means. One of them was brilliant, I thought, showing barefoot Gen, which is one way to show really graphic material, but in a way that maybe is consumable by watching it as a cartoon. And then also having the artwork from survivors. So I'm just going to do a little slideshow. And do you want to talk about your choice of visuals and how you came across this artwork, and then your decision about how you used the artwork to help tell your story, and then using the footage, actual footage, to come chronologically later. Can everyone see that slideshow? Okay. So I'm just going to go through the artwork and show it. And Steven, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think one thing that I really felt strongly about, having watched other films about the bombing, was that there were no motion picture cameras, and people, and I have myself just gone to this footage of the bomb after the bombing as if it was soon after the bomb, and there were no movie cameras in Hiroshima and Nagasaki till 6 weeks after the bombing. So I mean, the horror and the chaos is not in those images. And so I really felt strongly not to, when the people are telling the story the day of the bomb, that we should not inject it with photos from 6 weeks later or movie footage. And so the best way, the most honest way, I think, was presenting the day of the bomb was to use images. At least they weren't drawn on the day of the bomb, but they were from the memories of the survivors. Some of them, fairly recent, but these were images that were really powerful for them. And I thought, the collection of the drawings is called Unforgettable Fire, and it was put together initially through NHK and the Hiroshima Peace Museum. And someone had done a couple drawings and sent them in, and there was a lot of interest. And so NHK and the Peace Museum just did an open call and said anyone who has drawings or paintings of the bomb that they want to have part of our collection, please send them in. And the response was incredible. They got more than 10,000 drawings and paintings from people. And some of them were, some people just did, had, no art background, and some were, really gifted people who worked in oils and stuff. But there's a power to, a lot of power, there's power even in the roughest drawings that say so much more. And so we just filmed, their collection, and someone watches you because, you're shooting the originals and they're very fragile on paper or whatever. And so we just as many as possible. And I made a selection from the 10,000, and we just tried to shoot as many as we could, and then use them as the stories are told in the film. But it's so on the day of the bombing, there was one still photographer who was, a journalist, who was a photojournalist in Hiroshima, but he was so overwhelmed by what he saw, and he found it so horrific that in a Japanese kind of way, he thought it would be impolite to take pictures of people's misery. So he only took 5 photos, and they're all kind of from a distance. Obviously, he was, he was over, he was really distraught and stuff. But I just read an interview with him the other day, and about what he was sort of thinking, and he was sort of caught up with what he saw, but he sort of, I don't know, unconsciously or not, really stayed distant from it. And there are 5 photos, but they don't tell you very much. And they're, the conditions for it was incredibly hot and smoky, and there was utter chaos around him. So those 5 photos don't really tell you that much. A few weeks later, I think, I forget exactly, but perhaps 2 or 3 weeks later, some still photographers, 2 still photographers came down from Tokyo. Well, I think several came down to take and try to document. Some of them were more interested in the structural damage and were uncomfortable shooting the survivors. Others, really shot everything they could. And so, but the United States, after the occupation forces asked for all those photos to be collected, and 2 of the photographers didn't deliver, or delivered copies of their work and kept them for years hidden. And so their work is, so we used those 2 photographers in the film. I have no idea what happened to the other photographers who delivered their negatives and proof sheets to the Americans. There's no evidence of anything. If they appear, they never appear, so they were probably destroyed. But so anyway, then the motion picture, a motion picture crew from Tokyo called Nihon Eigasha came to Hiroshima and Nagasaki 6 weeks after the bomb. So there's a kind of order, there's a kind of strange quiet, and you see people getting help from doctors, and so I think, and nurses, and a lot of nurses, and on some of the nurses you can see are scarred, have burn scars on, and so you can see that some of them were local, but 90% of the doctors and nurses in Hiroshima were killed or badly injured, and all the hospitals were either destroyed or really badly damaged. So when you see this footage of people getting care, there was none of that, during the bombing. There were all the doctors and nurses were incapacitated. There were very few, and so I really did not want to use that motion picture footage until it was appropriate in the story. And so so as a device, we sort of, told the early part of the bombing with just the drawings and paintings, which, as you can see, are incredibly powerful. And I don't know, when you look at them, you sort of try to think, what is really going on there? It's kind of beyond, horror. It's kind of beyond imagination. But it gives you, something, it tells you something. And I think the abstraction, of the works too, somehow says a lot, of how they're remembering it. And anyway, and then when we're telling the story about the aftermath of a couple of weeks, then I use the stills. And then when we're telling the much later aftermath, when people are experiencing radiation effects like their hair falling out, then we go to the film footage. But it's one thing I feel, really good about, that we're very conscious with White Light, Black Rain to, try to be as appropriate as possible with the use of the footage and the photographs, and to not use Hiroshima footage in Nagasaki and back and forth. And, I'm pretty sure, that everything is fairly correct in the film. Whereas in most films, it's crazy what people just throw in, because there's no one fact checking a film about Hiroshima, especially as the years go by, where you don't have a Hiroshima historian who was there, who knows, oh, that doesn't belong there. So we tried as best as we could to be true to the materials and people's stories.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought that was, I think that's why both are so strong, but White Light, Black Rain really does a really great job of incorporating that in a timely and respectful manner. So I was wondering, I would like to show that video clip that you've sent me. Maybe we can tie that into the discussion. But I was kind of curious, where are you at these days with the hibakusha story? Do you feel like there's still more story there that you want to tell? And did anyone approach you this year for 75, because it was 75 years? Were you asked to comment at all? And yep.
Very, I've had very little reaction. I mean, because of the pandemic, you know, the memorials in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were very low key. Really, in Hiroshima, well, they closed the Peace Park. The ceremonies built around, you know, 8:15, the time of the bombing. And so they closed the park to, you know, visitors from 7 to 9 o'clock. And the park was just politicians and dignitaries. And so, and they had a very small ceremony. And of course, people, you know, were 6 feet apart in seating. And so it was very low key. But essentially the ceremony was the same official one that they do all the time, with people, the mayor gives speeches and the prime minister gives.
I don't know. I have the audio now. I don't know what happened to his picture.
You know, but there was not, you know, this was supposed to be the time of the Tokyo Olympics also. So people weren't planning for the 75th anniversary was going to be really, you know, pretty low key anyway, because, you know, people were going to be all focused on the Olympics. The Japanese government was completely focused on the Olympics. My impression was they did not want, you know, the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima to be, you know, for people to flock to that story. And so it was all pretty, you know, subdued. And then because of the pandemic, it was more subdued. So I talked very little, and it went by, and people I know in Hiroshima who often talk to press did not, and and then to the question about more stories, you know, when I did White Light, Black Rain, I felt like I had this like mandate of getting as much as possible in, and you know, that this was just an extraordinary opportunity that HBO just said yes, when normally, you know, I mean, it would be impossible in, you know, my experience to get anyone else to do it, and unless it was just a fluke, and this was a fluke. An executive at HBO wanted to do it, and that's all it took. And but even in the making of the film, her name's Sheila Nevins, and she was the president of documentaries at HBO, and she would say, you know, have you done everything you want? Have you put everything you want in the film? And I said, well, I've thought about this, but, you know, I'm worried that people, you know, are going to turn the channel if we do this, if we show some of this color footage. And she said, you know, we don't care. Just make the film that you want to make and tell the whole story. Don't leave it out. People, you might not have another chance to do this at this time. And I was really, my first cut of the film was kind of poetic, and it was more accessible. It was more like, it was, you know, it had more the feel of the Mushroom Club. It was not as journalistic, and it was less, had less footage that would really upset people. And she said, you know, that the film is too nice. You should not, you should just put it all in and don't be afraid. Tell the story as well as you can and as fully as you can. And so it really was a lot of that encouragement that made the film the way it is, which is really pretty unblinking. I mean, especially when we get to the aftermath and we have the 2 Nagasaki survivors who just suffered enormously, and you see the damage to their bodies. And we have the man, Mr. Taniguchi, who was just horribly scarred, and you see color footage of his back, and then you see him now, and he shows his ribs that are all showing, and says, you can see my heart beating through through this open wound. And we and I just heard the producer's voice, and put it all in. You might not have the opportunity to do that, for another film. This is the only film. Just make it and show it. So that was the attitude with the making of the film. And when I was initially done, I thought, thank God, I've done everything I can. I've told every story I can think of, and so I never have to feel. I can leave Hiroshima behind and go on to make other kinds of films. Maybe cheerful films about music or something. And honestly, as soon as I started showing the film, and I went to Hiroshima again to show the film, and I went to Nagasaki to show it, and then we showed it in Tokyo. We had the film played, besides being on NHK, it played in Tokyo for 9 months at a theater, and they sold out for about 6 months. And there was tremendous response. Even from all sides. There were actors, Koji Yakusho, who you mentioned, who's in Mifune, who's the star of, Shall We Dance, and Tampopo, and just a terrific actor. I mean, one of the great actors of Japan. He was from Nagasaki, and he, wherever he went, he promoted the film, and so they had huge the response to the film in Japan was amazing. Anyway, so there was a lot of feedback, and as soon as I was walking around with the film and talking to people, I thought, oh, here they would pitch more stories, and they would say, I know this person, this happened to them, and so you'd hear, and I just thought, okay, well, I wouldn't. Maybe there's maybe I'll return to the story. It's very. It's a really rewarding thing to do the film, but it's kind of, I don't know, you have this, whenever you're doing it, it's a little bit, I don't know, I get kind of defensive because, wherever I go, well, the question people always ask filmmakers is, what are you working on? And if I say I'm working film about Hiroshima, 90% of the people just get uncomfortable and just say, oh, okay. And they move on to the next subject. So I feel, and that somehow actually makes me, want to do it more, but it's also, I feel like I get into this space where I get a sort of sense of mission again. And so I have been thinking about doing something more on Hiroshima, and I've shot a little footage, and have been talking to the Hiroshima Peace Museum about shooting some of the objects in the Hiroshima Peace Museum, with the idea of how do you tell the Hiroshima story after the survivors are gone? And so, and you'll have to, you can tell it through the next generation, perhaps. The children and grandchildren of hibakusha are becoming more active, and you'll have to find other ways. And so I think that's sort of rough idea of the next film.
Mm-hmm. Well, that cues up. Can I show this little clip? I'll see if I can do it. It's very short, about 2.5 minutes, or a little under 3 minutes. And you want to say a little something before I show it?
Well, there's no narration, there's no talking. It's just visuals of some of the events around the August 6th in Hiroshima over the last couple of years, and it's just a couple scenes uh, around and sort of building to, I don't know, talking about the dead, and I can explain the footage a little bit more after you see it.
Okay, let me see if I can. Okay, here we go. Thanks. So 14 artifacts, is that the premise here, what you were talking about?
Artifacts is a working title, and I haven't quite figured out. I mean, initially I was going to tell the stories of 14 objects inside the Hiroshima Peace Museum. There are 10, 20,000 objects in the museum that are all kept in temperature controlled rooms. The small objects are in these clean cedar boxes, and you know, there are various objects. You know, a bowl that's, you know, has pieces of rice fused into the ceramics, and you know, the twisted, you know, glass items. But I think most of the stories will be about the people that owned those objects, and sort of looking for a way to tell it. I'm thinking of including other artifacts too that tell a story of the bombing. Today I was researching Einstein's letter that encouraged Franklin Roosevelt to begin work on the bomb. as an artifact. And so it's still in, still working through the process. And since I can't, normally I would be in Japan. I would have been in Japan for August 6th and trying to figure it out and doing some filming. So since I can't, I've just been sort of thinking it through and playing with footage that I have. And so there's the footage I had in there. One is, you first see the peace groups that come to Hiroshima every year from all over, and they march, and of course they're always followed around by the right-wing militarist protesters who are in those big black bluish trucks with loudspeakers blaring pro-military, pro-emperor slogans, and just trying to disrupt things. And then at 8:15, everyone lies on the ground, and they have a die-in, it's called. Anyway, the protests have been going on since this first anniversary after the bomb, and you can see, if you see the old Japanese movie, the old French movie, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's 1959. It came out in 1959. So you can see there's footage of Hiroshima protests in that film. When I'm there, it's sort of, those are the things I follow. They have the big thing with the prime minister, and I usually avoid that because it's really empty and kind of horrible. And they usually have a orchestra, the high school orchestra, playing these kind of some dirge Western song, pieces, but I always go across the street from the Peace Park, and there's a memorial on the other side of this big boulevard, Peace Boulevard, and there's a memorial for what used to be called Hiroshima's first municipal girls' school, and it's now called Funa-iri High School. But that school lost more students than any other school, and so that woman that you see singing, she missed school that day, and so she survived. But the entire first and second year classes, which was 541 girls and 7 teachers that were with them, they vaporized. And so they there's no ashes for them, there's no even belongings or school books that are available, so there are no artifacts at all from that whole those 2 classes. And so I don't know, I was looking for a way to tell some of that story. I've been thinking about ways of telling some of that story, of people who, there's nothing of. That school actually, since the school was burned down too, the school records disappeared. And so even now, whenever they have, on August 6th, they have a big board up with a class picture, and they're trying to, they don't even know some of the names of the students who died. And so they're trying to hopefully fill out everybody's names. But most of the 541 girls have been identified, but there are still, maybe 20 or 30 girls that they don't even know who they were, because, they just disappeared off the earth, and as did their names and records, and their families. And so no one even knows who they were. And so, I think it's, it's kind of a, it's a good way of showing how, that story keeps going, and you can hear the pain and that, and longing and grief in that woman's voice still. So I don't know, that just something I'm working on while I can't go anywhere, and trying to figure out what the film should be. My daughter Daisy has been studying Japanese every summer for the last couple summers, and in an immersion program. And so last year she went and spent a month in Hiroshima and was there for August 6th last year. And she actually just wrote a piece about it for a magazine called Afar, a travel magazine. But she and I were going to work, I was going to work on the film with her. But I don't know, the whole mess with school and her school schedule's been so messed up with the pandemic, and she's I don't know, it's been really distracting, and now she's of course thinking about trying to figure out which college she wants to go to. So I don't know, we might do it together if I can get a little time from her, but I might have to do it on my own.
Oh man. Oh yeah, tough time to be a high schooler right now.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can't believe that we've been talking for nearly 2 hours. You are great. So we have a couple things that we can do as we sort of wrap things up. There are a bunch of questions and comments in the chat, and so I don't want to forget anyone. So I will try to go through the chat kind of quickly, but also it would be great if Tanemori-san is still in the audience, or if Jerry or Kay or anybody else wants to say a few words, we can unmute, we can get you to unmute your microphone and talk to Steven. Just feel free. But let me get to some of these questions. One is, it's a comment. In White Light, Black Rain, there was a photo of the Hiroshima maidens for treatment in the US. It bothered me that the group looked like tourists. Who's that? Picture of a dog.
The pictures, it bothered you that they were all sort of smiling and as they were getting off the plane on the plane is well, that they were doing it for the news crews, and I'm sure their handlers. The maidens came over, and they were mostly sponsored by the Friends, the Quakers, along with this writer Norman Cousins, and
okay, you're unmuted. Okay.
So well, the whole Hiroshima Maidens episode is upsetting. I mean, they essentially they were sort of trying to make Americans feel like, okay, you're looking after these 20 girls and healing them, and in that healing, healing all the wounds of all the hibakusha. And then when the maidens got back to Japan, they had a really hard time because people felt like they had gotten all this special treatment, and they were hounded, and they're still the last living maidens really rough time. And that's a film I at one time wanted to try to make, a film about the maidens, because there's a strong connection to the Americans in the story. But so few of the maidens would participate. They were just felt so burned by any media. So I don't know. I haven't talked. I was not. I got to know two of them very well, but have never been able to talk to more than that. I've always been curious. I mean, the two I talked to, that's became their whole lives, and they had really difficult lives. One of them that stayed in Hiroshima had a really difficult time. Her name was Yamaoka, and she's in the Mushroom Club. And so anyway, hi, Kay.
Hi, Kay. Do you want to talk a little bit? Or we have Tanemori-san. Do you want to talk a little bit? Do you have video? We can see you, or do you just want to talk?
All right, thank you so much for this special event. And Steve Okazaki, nice to see you. And I have not seen you since 85 or early 90, when you moved to Berkeley from San Francisco. Good to see you. Thank you so much.
Great to see you. How have you been?
Oh, doing great. I'm still kicking, like back in 1985 and 90. You and I had a lots of communication were going on. But again, we were there in the Los Angeles 25th on the Japan Expo, and you showed the film, Black Rain. And I was there with you. And since then, I kind of lost your contact. Now, regarding what you have said, several points, this may not be correct because my hearing aid, I'm getting old, so you may have to just excuse me. But you mentioned that some young people who are going to tell the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki may, just in a quote, may be influenced by their emotion or interpretation. And this might interpret, put in an extra sense that they may distort the truth per se. And also, I have been hearing many weeks, those survivors feel they need to tell the story to young people. So this war, atomic bomb, will not happen again. And well, that's wonderful. But my question is, they are talking about the abolition of nuclear bomb as a means for peace, stopping the suffering and this and that. But my question to those survivors who promoting abolition of nuclear bomb, those peace promoters who are promoting abolition of nuclear bomb, do they know how to do it? Do they know how many nuclear bombs in the world where they're hiding? And I wonder whether or not they know how to put all the nuclear bomb back to genie bottles. And secondly, was this, I wonder if and when, which I do not want, but if and when atomic bomb used again in different fashions, different countries, different locations in the world. But my question is, these young people, do they know how to handle it? These survivors who are telling the story, they have, I say, they have yet to tell how to find the peace, healing for their suffering. And so I just want to let you know my feeling. Then also I mentioned I did meet General Tibbets in the spring of 2001, 2000 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Perhaps I might be the only survivor who ever confronted with him and why, wherefore he got it again. But he said, after 8 different questions, he said, if I have a chance to do it again, he said he will do it. I mean, that's totally contrary to the 5-star General Douglas MacArthur. He said, I have been a soldier for 52 years. We have tried to resolve the human conflict by any means, negotiation, dialogue, and even engaging the war. But somehow we are using the wrong method because we are not dealing the core, the true heart of a human conflict, that is the spiritual, the heart. Therefore, he said at the September 22nd, 1953, at his farewell speech before the Congress, he said, if we are to resolve the human conflict, we need to deal with the heart, the spiritual. And thus he said, all soldiers never die, just fading away. So I agree with him, and seeing what he has done for Japan. And tomorrow, Japan's surrender day, August 15th. And somehow, General Douglas MacArthur said, we have to bring Japan as one nation. After all, so many thousands soldiers gave their lives, sacrificed their lives for their sake. I have to, against all the Zaibatsu and even Emperor Hirohito's cabinet. He said, I have to bring Japan into one nation. And so he is my hero. He is the one I believe with all my heart. If we deal the heart, which is I discovered the greatest enemy was my darkness of heart, not nuclear bomb itself. Well, again, thank you so much, Steven Okazaki-san. Arigato. Thank you so much, your energy.
Thank you, Tanimura-san. You sound very genki. Hey, Jerry.
Hey, Stephen. That was really wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, the compassion and just your heart. I really appreciate very much, especially in the stories of the atomic bomb survivors. You know, their stories are so moving, and those drawings were so vivid. And I think your new project sounds exciting to me in terms of the story behind it, the story behind the artifacts. I think it's important to tell those stories too.
Oh, thanks. Well, maybe I can talk to you and get you to help me.
Well, good to see you. We all share the sake, okay?
Yeah.
We have a sake.
Yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know, you know, Stephen was one of the original founders of the Friends of Hibakusha. And I remember he was working on the film, The Survivors. And that's when I first met him. And he really inspired us to, you know, to get together and provide support for atomic bomb survivors here, you know, who are residing here in the United States. So I really appreciate that. And that was in 1981 or so, yeah, or a little bit before that, yeah.
Yeah, well, I remember when I first got involved with them, there was just one sensei, Sheridan Tatsuno, who was working with them.
Right.
And I think Sheridan was leaving town, going to the East Coast or something. And I realized, oh, we got to get some new senseis involved. So, you and I and Kay.
Yes.
And
Hanoka Sensei.
Yeah, and Dorothy Stroop.
Dorothy Stroop.
Yeah, it was I don't know, it was really I thank you, and Kay for sticking with it, and I get a lot of lot of perks for doing the film and stuff, and it's not, you guys do the really hard work, and you've been there for the hibakusha community and in the Bay Area particularly. I mean, I thank you for that.
And congratulations, Jerry, on Virtual Remembrance.
Oh, that was really a very collaborative effort. It's just it does take a village, So it was really wonderful to have so much support by everyone. Everyone's heart was really in it. So I think that's what really brought it together.
Yeah, you could tell. You could definitely tell, and you look great. And then starting tomorrow, is it that the video or the broadcast of the show will be available. Do you want to say where that's going to be available?
On YouTube?
Oh, is it on the Nichibei YouTube?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So anybody who missed Virtual Remembrance on August 9th, this past Sunday, you can catch it on a rebroadcast, or it's available on demand, I guess, on the Nichibei YouTube channel. And they'll have all of the interviews they interviewed 3 hibakusha and showed 3 videos. I know you had technical problems with one of the videos, but I understand you've added it for the upload, right? So now people can see Kathy
Witness to Hiroshima.
Sloan's.
Yeah, Witness to
Yeah.
Hiroshima. And of
Great.
course, Emiko, she did a film especially for Nagasaki, and it's the world premiere of her film. So, yeah, it's
That was
wonderful.
awesome.
Everyone's
Yeah.
heart was really in there. And
Oh,
Kay, she's always been there for us.
I'd like to acknowledge there's a number of people that I can see here who've helped us out year after year after year with the biennial medical exam, like Kimi, Tak and Pat, Haruko, Ruth,
Mari Matsumoto.
I can't see everybody, but yeah, it's been a real community effort.
that's great. Everybody raise your hand if you you've been helping out with the biannual visits. Shall I turn to just a few more questions, and I'll leave it open for everybody to also just chime in with any comments. Jerry or Kay or anybody, if you want to just chime in, please do. But one thing, Stephen, I want to ask, I've gotten several queries here, is you had very generously made access available to your 2 films on Vimeo. And it was through, I think, tonight. So I'm getting requests to know if you could keep the access open through the weekend.
Sure. Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, well, thank you. So any of you who didn't get a chance to see the films, please see them this weekend. So thanks, Stephen. I also want to acknowledge that apparently there was a power outage in Oakland. So we lost a few of you during this, but I think Jill's recording it. So if you missed any part of it, then I think it'll be available on the J-Sei YouTube channel, maybe. So we'll find out about that. All right. So other comments. Oh, this is from Pam. Your films are so important for our next generations. My relatives were either killed or were hibakusha, and my 90-year-old uncle, still living in Hiroshima, finally told me when I visited 2 years ago that he was severely injured. I understand now about their silence all these years. Thank you, Pam, for sharing that. From Kayoko, thank you, Mr. Okazaki. We watched your film with our teenager, and we are so grateful for your work. We are a Japanese and Jewish family, and we hope to teach the next generation, never again. Wondering about any thoughts you had during the making of White Light, Black Rain about the Japanese American concentration camps in the US during World War II, and also the Holocaust in Europe.
Just whatever this is.
Keep going. Oh, from John. Around the time Survivors came out, over 200 hibakusha participated in the SF medical examinations. In 2019, only 30 something participated. So we're losing that generation. From Alan, Stephen, were there any feelings towards you being a Japanese American, I guess, by the interviewees?
I guess I think a lot of Japanese really don't know what a Japanese American is unless they saw some NHK show about Japanese Americans. So, you know, they'd ask like where my Japanese family was, but you know, unless they have relatives that they're in contact with, you know, they don't seem that curious. You know, they just go, so, but yeah, nothing more.
Sometimes when I was in Japan and I would say that I was Japanese American, they assumed that one of my parents was white. Yeah. So then I would get further questions about that. I'd say, no, nope.
Well,
so yeah.
I remember the first time I went to Japan in '80. There had been a Japanese TV show. There had been an NHK drama series called Sangamoyu, which was about a Japanese American family. And so every time I met someone, they say, "Oh," I'd say, "I'm Japanese American." They'd say, "Oh, like Sangamoyu." So, but you know. And they used to say, "Oh, do you live near Disneyland?" But now that they have their own Disneyland, they don't care. Yeah.
Okay, here's one from Ellen regarding the scientists who took part in the development of the bomb. Were they interviewed by any Japanese Americans or Caucasians? They appeared to speak very freely about their roles. After the documentary was completed, what kind of feedback did you receive from these interviewees?
Yeah. Well, for the American side of the story, I mean, we wanted to interview anyone who was on the, you know, on the planes that dropped the bomb on the Enola Gay, or the plane that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. And Paul Tibbets, who Tom Morrison met, was still alive there, but he was not capable of doing an interview. His memory was pretty much gone. But we were lucky enough that all the four last people that we found, two of them were military, and then three of them and two of them were scientists, observing, and and they were all open to doing the interview. Although I have to say we did not hide anything from them, but you know, the associate producer for the American content was named Jules Greenberg, and so Jules got in contact with them and, you know, told them what we were doing totally openly. But some of them didn't realize that the director was Japanese American, and so there was not an issue with that, except one of them. I mean, all the interviews went fine, and they were, you know, and you know, of course, I asked them all the questions. You know, did they, you know, think at all about what was happening down below, or then or in later years, and you know, all of them were, you know, a bit defensive and found their own, you know, way to deal with, you know, whatever those kinds of feelings might be. I mean, I personally felt like, you know, they were soldiers, they were military, they, you know, it's not like anyone could have said, wait a minute, this is wrong. You know, they were just following orders like all soldiers do. And the scientists were not soldiers, and they were clearly, you know, kind of excited being part of history. But anyway, one of them said after the interview, really angrily, he said, I didn't realize that, you know, Japanese person would be asking me this question, and you know, you guys lied to me, and he was really defensive, and though luckily again not in the interview, and I you know, I talked to him afterwards, and I tried, when it came up, I tried not to say, you know, what I wanted to say, which would have been, I guess, the best defense, which is, you know, my father, you know, was in the military, you know, he went to Germany and fought the Nazis, and, you know, but I didn't. I felt like that would be saying, you know, oh, if my father wasn't in, I would, you know, in the Army, that I wouldn't have, you know, that somehow that would be more justified because, you know, my dad fought in the military. And so I just tried to talk to him, and he said, you know, we're not here to do a good guys, bad guys movie. And it's the last thing I wanted to do. I just wanted them to tell their stories as well as they could and as fully as they could. And I think they did. And we had loads of questions for all of them, and they answered them all. Sometimes, you know, sometimes you went, well, one of them, when we left his house, I looked at his bumper sticker, and it was much more, it was, you know, his bumper stickers were much more pointed and political than he was, but, you know, and, no, I mean, it was, we had, there was one of the guys who was a co-pilot, Theodore Van Kirk. He did one of our screenings in New York, and one of the survivors was there, and he was incredibly uncomfortable. I'd never seen anyone so uncomfortable, and he, you know, he didn't. I think the audience was interested in Hiroshima, so they, you know, I mean, sort of, I think they were, you know, looking for him to, I don't know, apologize or something, but, you know, I felt bad for him. He, you know, it was just trying to talk about his part in history. And, but I, you know, it's very conscious in the film. I just don't feel it's about good guys and bad guys. It's, you know, and so I presented their stories completely separately because, you know, they happen in different time, you know, and just they told their stories up to when they dropped the bomb and watched it fall. And then we pick up the story from, you know, what happens down below. But it just seemed really exploitive to mix up the interviews. So I felt like the best, you know, the most respectful and honest way to treat them would be to just tell their story separately. And for me, it makes it more interesting. It made it more interesting.
Yeah, thanks. Let me fit in a few more comments here. From Keiko, the two movies were very sincere but shocking. I understand that 85% of population in Japan were born after World War II, as I am, and we need to have a documentary such as these to remind us to search for peace.
It was interesting showing the film in Japan. The first thing everyone talked about, I think the thing that really was most controversial and the thing that people brought up the most was the opening of the film. People were really shocked, and I was shocked when we went down, you know, the most popular teenage street in Tokyo, the Yasukuni Dori, and not a single person knew what happened on August 6, 1945, and I think we did 8, and then I thought, well, let's just quit and we'll just put them all in. But people in Japan were really taken aback by that. So I mean, I thought we'd get some interesting answers that people would know. I did not expect no one to know. And so I mean, it's obvious that the Hiroshima story, I mean, there are lots of schools all over Japan that go visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki and learn a lot about it. Of course, they do get more of the, you know, the children's softer stories about Sadako and the Thousand Cranes. But, you know, there are a lot of more liberal leaning schools that go there, but it seems to me in general that Japanese education is playing Hiroshima and Nagasaki down. And, you know, I mean, when, you know, to me, the big, you know, the powerful thing is that the Japanese view Hiroshima and Nagasaki separately from all of the rest of World War II. I mean, they tell those stories separately as if, you know, okay, we were not, you know, we were just victims here, but, you know, and I think that really does it a disservice. I mean, Japan's, you know, the militarism and the corruption of the government and the responsibility of the emperor, I think is just really disturbing. Is never, and is that's if, but their Japanese are never openly going to talk about that stuff in their history books. So certainly they have to. So Hiroshima is also not dealt with completely honestly.
Well, so from Reiko True, thank you so much for persisting to make the film. Thank you for persisting through all the obstacles. I don't know who this is, but maybe you know who this is. Hi, Uncle Steven. Enjoyed listening to you speak. Christy.
Christy, what are you doing in there? That's
Christy, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi. I'm with Mom, Susan.
this is my niece and sister in Los Angeles. How'd you guys get on here?
Through Leanne.
Oh.
I think she volunteers with them, so she sent me the invite. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think Dai and Denise are on too.
Good.
You like that? Surprise.
Okay, so we're going to have an Okazaki family reunion at this point.
Okay, we'll pick it up later.
Okay. Bye.
You know, we can keep this Zoom meeting going all night, and then, you know, you just continue with your family discussion, and then we'll all go to bed. I have another comment here from John. Thank you, Stephen. Wondering what your sense of interest and awareness about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki among Japanese young people has, oh, this is from Mari. Sorry, not from John. Has interest been growing or waning in recent years? I was wondering about that too, because, you know, as part of movie night, we talked about this anime that came out a couple of years ago. It was called In This Corner of the World.
Yeah.
That was a beautiful film about the bombing of Hiroshima. And, you know, just wondering if in the 13 years or so since White Light, Black Rain, if you think there's been maybe a bit of a change.
I think that in general, it's still, you know, this small voice that breaks through in Japan every so often. I mean, the Corner of the World film was really interesting. It had a huge response. It did really well at the box office. So, I mean, it's about the town near Hiroshima, and so it's sort of an indirect way of telling the story, but it's, you know, was really well done and got a great response, and clearly shows that people are interested. But you know, I would say, I don't know, I would say that the interest in the story and is pretty much diminished. I mean, is slipping every year in general. I mean, if something comes out, you know, people have an opportunity to respond, but there's not, you know, a lot out in the culture for people to respond to. And certainly there are no open discussions really unless about the bomb. I mean, particularly, you know, this year was everything was, you know, it seemed like the year in which the discussions of the bomb would pretty much peter off, and then people would be fixated on the Tokyo Olympics and then talking about that afterwards for many years. And so, I think, you know, but clearly, you know, people still care given the opportunity. I mean, again, the response to White Light, Black Rain was just totally out of the blue. And we had no idea the response would be so great in Japan. There wasn't a feeling like, oh, we've heard this before, you know. There was a real eagerness to see the film and to hear these stories, and in a way that was not just, you know, your little news story that shows up on the daily news for 3 minutes about this hibakusha here or there. But I don't know. It's hard to gauge. You know, I think after Fukushima, there was kind of a swelling of, before Fukushima, I felt like the peace movement and the anti-nuke movement is really organized, but in a kind of very Japanese way. It's kind of clubby, and they really are afraid of outsiders. And many of the peace groups, the radical peace groups in Japan, based in Tokyo, and all the peace groups have kind of baggage. But I felt like the peace movement in Japan was pretty much losing steam. But then when after Fukushima, there were just bigger protests than they've ever had. But somehow the Japanese government sort of kept acting like they cared too, and were doing things about Fukushima, and slowly it fell out of the news, and you know, we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of, you know, Fukushima, and it'll be interesting to see how much discussion there will be then.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, it is now 9 o'clock, so I think we've kept you for a very long time, but thank you so much, Steven. You were fantastic. And, you know, don't forget.
Could I add a word?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Weinberg, and Tanemori-san and I've been working together with the Silkworm Peace Institute, which he founded in '85. We've been about 9 years now. I just wanted to share that it's very interesting that General Paul Tibbets and Squadron Leader Mitsu Fuchida became friends later in their lives. They actually developed a relationship and a friendship. And I think in the context of the fact that it's so difficult to talk about the history and how things look one way from one perspective in the war, that it's a really remarkable friendship that it's remarkable that this came about. And so in the situations like you described where you know, members of the military try to talk about their stories in the context that they lived it, that's all the reason more why it's important to be an honest historian and really look at things from the different perspectives. So, and then I also just wanted to say, share my appreciation for the sensitivity that Steve has shown to hibakusha for all these years and throughout the works that he's been doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.